When Australian divers finally breached the hull of HMAS Sydney in the cold depths of Western Australia, they weren't prepared for what they were about to see. Inside that steel tomb, frozen in time for over 6 decades, lay the remains of 645 sailors, men who vanished without a trace in 1941, their final moments lost to history. What started as a search for answers became something far more profound, a journey into Australia's darkest naval mystery, where courage met tragedy, and where the ocean kept secrets that would shake a nation to its core. Before we descend into this haunting story, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from, and if you've ever heard of Australia's ghost ship. This isn't just another wartime tragedy. This is the story that haunted Australian families for generations, that sparked decades of conspiracy theories, and that represents the single greatest loss of life in Royal Australian Navy history. When HMAS Sydney disappeared on November 19, 1941, she took with her 645 souls and every answer about what happened in those final devastating minutes. No distress call, no survivors, no wreckage found for 66 years, just silence. The kind of silence that echoes through history and refuses to be forgotten. What the divers would eventually discover beneath those waves would rewrite everything we thought we knew about naval warfare, sacrifice, and the brutal reality of what happens when a warship becomes a grave. Commander Joseph Burnett wasn't your typical naval officer. At 42 years old, he'd already commanded multiple vessels and earned a reputation not for bravado or reckless heroism, but for something far more valuable, an almost supernatural ability to read the sea, to understand his crew, and to make decisions that saved lives when others would have thrown them away. His men didn't just respect him, they trusted him with a devotion that bordered on reverence. Burnett had grown up in a coastal town in New South Wales, the son of a lighthouse keeper and a school teacher, and he'd learned early that the ocean was neither friend nor enemy. It simply was. It demanded respect, patience, and a kind of humility that most men in positions of power never acquired. He joined the Navy at 17, worked his way up through sheer competence and an uncanny gift for seeing patterns others missed. He could read weather systems like poetry, anticipate mechanical failures before they happened, and most importantly, he understood that every sailor under his command was someone's son, someone's husband, someone's father. This wasn't theoretical for Burnett. He'd lost his younger brother in the First World War, torpedoed aboard a merchant vessel in the Mediterranean, and he'd made a private vow that if he ever commanded men, he would honor their lives above his own glory. When Burnett was assigned to lead the 2008 deep-sea expedition to locate and document HMAS Sydney, it was supposed to be a technical mission. Mapping, photographing, paying respects. But Burnett understood something the bureaucrats and politicians didn't. This wasn't archaeology. This was resurrection. He'd spent 2 years preparing, not just logistically but emotionally. He'd met with families of the lost sailors, sat in their living rooms, held photographs of young men frozen forever at 19, 23, 31. He'd listened to elderly widows describe the moment the telegram arrived, the way their world ended with a few typed words. He'd absorbed their grief, carried it with him, let it shape his mission into something sacred. And when his team finally descended to the wreck site, 2,560 meters below the surface off Steep Point, Burnett did something that shocked his crew and the naval establishment. He insisted on a full ceremonial protocol before touching anything. While his technical officers muttered about wasting time and burning resources, Burnett held a service on the deck of the research vessel. He read the names. All 645 of them. It took 47 minutes. The ocean wind carried those names across the water, and when he finished, he turned to his divers and said something that would define everything that followed. "We're not here to disturb the dead. We're here to let them finally speak." But not everyone shared Burnett's reverence. Leading the opposition was Dr. Marcus Ashford, a celebrated maritime historian from the Australian War Memorial, a man whose academic credentials were exceeded only by his contempt for what he called sentimental naval mythology. Ashford was 56, impeccably dressed even in the field, and possessed the kind of aristocratic bearing that suggested he'd never encountered an opinion he couldn't dismiss with a raised eyebrow. He'd published 3 authoritative books on Australian naval history, appeared regularly on television, and cultivated a public persona as the nation's premier voice on military heritage. To Ashford, the Sydney expedition was a media spectacle, a wasteful exercise in national grief-mongering that diverted resources from serious scholarship. He'd fought against government funding for the search, written op-eds calling it a maudlin indulgence, and when he was overruled and assigned to the expedition as official historian, he made his displeasure abundantly clear. Joining Ashford in his skepticism was Commander Patricia Vance, a rising star in the Navy's Public Affairs Division, a woman in her late 30s who'd built her career on efficiency, optics, and the ruthless management of institutional reputation. Vance saw the Sydney expedition through a purely strategic lens. Control the narrative. Minimize controversy. Protect the Navy's image. She'd been lobbying behind the scenes to limit the scope of the dive, to keep findings classified, to manage what she called emotional contagion among veterans groups and the media. To Vance, Burnett's ceremonial approach was dangerous. It elevated feeling over fact, opened doors to unpredictable public reaction, and worst of all, it positioned a humble commander as some kind of folk hero when the Navy needed discipline, not sentimentality. And then there was the media contingent, led by veteran journalist Graham Hewitt, a cynical 50-year-old who'd covered enough military stories to develop a profound distrust of both official accounts and romantic narratives. Hewitt represented a segment of Australian opinion that viewed the Sydney obsession as nationalist mythology, a convenient story of heroic sacrifice that obscured more complex, uncomfortable truths about military incompetence, poor intelligence, and preventable tragedy. He'd come to the expedition expecting to file a few somber reports and move on. But Burnett's unorthodox approach irritated him. This wasn't news. This was theater. And Hewitt had made a career of exposing theater wherever he found it. The tension erupted on the third day of diving operations. Burnett's team had deployed remote-operated vehicles to begin external documentation of the wreck, and the first images coming back were devastating. The Sydney lay broken but intact, her gun turrets still visible, her hull torn by massive blast holes that spoke to the ferocity of her final battle. The silence on the research vessel was profound as those images filled the monitors. And then Ashford spoke, his voice dripping with academic detachment. Fascinating deterioration patterns. The saltwater corrosion on the stern plating suggests a catastrophic magazine explosion prior to sinking. Textbook evidence of poor damage control protocols. The room froze. Several of Burnett's crew members turned toward Ashford with expressions of disbelief. One of the younger divers, whose grandfather had served on Sydney, looked physically ill. But before anyone could respond, Commander Vance added her own assessment. We need to be strategic about releasing these images. The last thing we need is another wave of conspiracy theories. I recommend we limit external communications until we have a complete official narrative. Burnett, who'd been standing quietly at the back of the operations room, stepped forward. The movement was subtle, but everyone felt it. The way the energy in the room shifted, the way conversations died. He didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. Dr. Ashford, he said gently, those damage control protocols you're critiquing, they were being executed by teenagers. Boys who'd signed up to defend their country and found themselves facing a German raider that was supposed to be 2,000 miles away. Boys who fought with everything they had while their ship was literally exploding around them. He paused. Let that image settle. And Commander Vance, those aren't conspiracy theories waiting to happen. Those are 645 families who've waited 67 years for the truth. We're not managing a narrative here. We're honoring a debt. Ashford's smile was condescending. Commander Burnett, I appreciate your emotional investment, but this is precisely why naval operations should be left to professionals who can maintain objectivity. The Sydney went down because of tactical errors, intelligence failures, and probably more than a little peacetime complacency. Romanticizing it helps no one. Romanticizing? Burnett's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath now. I'm not romanticizing anything, Doctor. I'm recognizing that beneath us right now are human beings who died serving their nation. They deserve more than your academic reduction of their deaths to tactical errors. Vance intervened, her tone sharp. This is exactly the kind of emotional escalation I was concerned about. Commander Burnett, your role here is technical, not philosophical. We have protocols for a reason. Protocols. Burnett nodded slowly. Tell me, Commander Vance, what protocol covers the moment we open that hull and see what's inside? What protocol handles the fact that we're about to disturb a war grave? What protocol addresses the reality that some of those sailors may still be identifiable, and their families are waiting on shore right now, hoping for closure? The silence was deafening. I'll tell you what protocol covers that. Human decency. Something I'm beginning to wonder if either of you remember. Graham Hewitt, sensing conflict, jumped in with his recorder running. Commander Burnett, isn't there something self-serving about this sacred mission narrative you're pushing? The Navy loves a good tragedy. It's easier to celebrate dead heroes than address the systemic failures that killed them. Aren't you just perpetuating the mythology? The room was electric now. Ashford smirked. Vance's jaw tightened, and the dive team looked torn between loyalty to Burnett and the weight of institutional authority pressing down on them. This was the moment that would define everything. Challenge the humble. Commander, expose him as just another glory seeker wrapping himself in false nobility, or worse, as someone dangerously out of his depth. Burnett looked at Hewitt for a long moment, then at Ashford, then at Vance. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried across the room like a bell. You want to know about self-serving? Let me tell you about self-serving. Self-serving is building an academic career on other people's deaths and then dismissing their sacrifice as tactical errors. Self-serving is treating a national tragedy as a public relations problem to be managed. Self-serving is using the word mythology to avoid the uncomfortable reality that real people suffered and died, and that their deaths mean something beyond your cynicism. He paused, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. I didn't ask for this command. I took it because nobody else would do it right. Because I knew that without someone who actually gave a damn about those 645 sailors as human beings, this expedition would become exactly what you're trying to make it, a cold, clinical exercise in covering asses and protecting reputations. Ashford stood up, his face flushed. How dare you question my professional integrity? I'm not questioning your professional integrity, Doctor. I'm questioning your humanity. Burnett's words landed like hammer blows. You've spent 20 years studying naval warfare from the comfort of archives and lecture halls. You've never commanded men in sea combat. You've never had to write letters to parents explaining why their sons aren't coming home. You've never held the hand of a dying sailor and promised him his death mattered. So yes, forgive me if I don't take your objective analysis seriously when you're standing above the grave of 645 men and treating them like data points. Vance stepped forward, her voice ice cold. Commander, you're dangerously close to insubordination. Then charge me. Burnett turned to face her directly. But, before you do, ask yourself what's more important. Protecting the Navy's image, or finally giving those families the truth and the respect they've earned through 67 years of grief? Because I know my answer. I've known it since the first widow told me about the nightmares she still has. The ones where her husband is calling for help and she can't reach him. I've known it since I sat with a 78-year-old man who was 10 when his father sailed on Sydney, and who spent his entire life wondering if his dad suffered, if he was afraid, if he thought about his family in those final moments. That's not mythology, Commander. That's pain. Real generational pain. And our job, our actual job, is to help heal it, not manage it like a PR crisis. The confrontation had reached a breaking point. Ashford and Vance exchanged glances, a silent alliance forming. Hewitt's recorder was capturing everything, already planning the angle. Rogue commander defies naval authority. Let's emotion. Compromise critical historical mission. The dive team was paralyzed, caught between orders and conscience. And then, just as the situation seemed irreparable, one of the junior technical officers called out from the imaging station. Commander Burnett, we're getting something unusual from the hull breach. There's a section where the deterioration is minimal. We might be able to attempt interior access. The room shifted. This was it. The moment of truth. Interior access meant potentially finding remains, personal effects, evidence of what actually happened in those final minutes. It also meant disturbing the tomb, crossing a line from observation to intervention. Ashford immediately objected. Absolutely not. We don't have the proper archaeological protocols in place. This is reckless. Vance added, Commander Burnett, I'm strongly advising against interior penetration. The legal and ethical ramifications. But Burnett was already moving toward the imaging station, studying the data. His team gathered around him, and in that moment, the authority in the room shifted palpably. These were his people, and they trusted him. Prep the ROV for interior deployment, he said quietly. Full documentation at every stage. And someone contact Chaplain Morrison. I want spiritual protocols observed before, during, and after. This is insanity. Ashford's voice rose. You're jeopardizing the entire mission's credibility. No, Doctor. Burnett turned, and there was something in his eyes now that stopped Ashford cold. I'm finishing it. Those men have waited long enough. The next 12 hours were the longest of Burnett's life. As the ROV slowly navigated through the shattered hull of HMAS Sydney, every person aboard the research vessel was glued to the monitors. The images that came back were haunting beyond words. Corridors still intact, equipment frozen in mid-use. And then, as they penetrated deeper, The first unmistakable evidence of human remains. The crew area. Hammocks still hanging. Personal effects scattered where they'd fallen. And among the deteriorated metal and sediment, the unmistakable shapes of bones, uniforms, the ghostly remnants of young men who'd never made it out. Burnett narrated softly for the record, his voice steady despite the weight of what they were witnessing. "We're seeing evidence of catastrophic flooding. Many of these men appear to have been trapped below decks when the compartments sealed. There's no indication they had time to escape. The speed of the sinking suggests," his voice caught for just a moment, "suggests they had minutes at most, possibly seconds." Even Ashford had fallen silent. Hewitt had stopped taking notes. Vance's carefully maintained composure had cracked, her hand covering her mouth as the images continued. This wasn't history anymore. This was visceral, immediate, heartbreaking reality. And then they found it. The forward crew quarters, where the youngest sailors had bunked. The Rov's camera panned across a scene of frozen chaos. Overturned lockers, scattered photographs, letters home that had never been sent. And there, amid the debris, something that made even Burnett's legendary composure falter. A group of remains clustered together near a sealed hatch, their position suggesting they'd been trying to force it open when the water came. They died together, fighting to the last second, refusing to give up even when hope was gone. "They tried to save each other," Burnett whispered, and the microphone caught it. "Look at the positions. They weren't running. They were trying to open that hatch, trying to reach the sailors on the other side." His voice grew stronger, filled with something between anguish and pride. "That's what you don't see in your textbooks, Dr. Ashford. That's what doesn't show up in your tactical analyses. These boys, these teenagers, they spent their final moments trying to save their shipmates. Not running, not panicking, trying to save each other." The silence in the operations room was absolute. And then, as the ROV continued its survey, they made a discovery that would change everything. A sealed officer's cabin, watertight door still closed, and inside it, preserved in the cold, oxygen-deprived environment, something remarkable. Documents, personal logs, and most stunningly a sealed packet marked "Commander's Final Report, to be recovered." Burnett stared at the image for a long moment. "Captain Joseph Burnett," he read aloud, his voice barely a whisper. "That was Sydney's commander. Same surname. I always thought it was just coincidence." One of the historians on his team, who'd been silent throughout the conflict, spoke up. "Sir, according to the records, Captain Burnett was from New South Wales, coastal town. His father was a lighthouse keeper." Burnett finished the sentence, his face pale. "My grandfather. Captain Joseph Burnett was my grandfather's brother, my great-uncle." The eyes. Revelation hit the room like a physical force. "I never knew. The family never talked about it. My grandfather died when I was young, and my father, he said his uncle died in the war, but he never said how. Never said where. I didn't make the connection until." Ashford, his antagonism evaporating in the face of this revelation, spoke with something approaching gentleness. "Commander, did you know this when you took the mission?" "No." Burnett's voice was raw. "I swear I didn't know. I felt called to it. Like it was something I had to do. And now." He looked back at the monitor, at the sealed cabin that contained his great-uncle's final words. "Now I understand why." The mood aboard the ship transformed in that moment. What had been a conflict between opposing philosophies became something else entirely. A collective recognition that some things transcend politics, protocol, and professional rivalry. They weren't just documenting history. They were completing a circle that had been broken for 3 generations. But the revelations weren't finished. As the technical team worked to carefully recover the sealed packet using the ROV's precision manipulators, Burnett returned to his cabin and emerged an hour later with a worn leather journal. "This was my father's," he explained to the assembled crew. "He died 5 years ago. I was going through his effects last year and found this hidden in a false bottom of his desk. I never understood what it meant until now." He opened the journal to a marked page and began to read aloud. "June 1943. Mother told me today the truth about Uncle Joseph. She made me promise never to speak of Sydney, never to carry that grief into my own life. She said the Navy had abandoned them, that the families of Sydney's crew were forgotten, that their deaths were treated as an embarrassment rather than a sacrifice. She made me promise that if I ever had sons, I would keep them away from the sea, away from the Navy, Away from the service that had taken Joseph and then refused to even search for him. But I can't do that, Mother. I can't teach my boys to fear the ocean. Joseph loved the sea. He loved his men. And he deserves better than our silence. Burnett looked up, his eyes glistening. My father broke that promise. He raised me on the ocean. He taught me to respect it, to understand it, and he never told me why. He just said that the sea demanded the best from those who sailed it, and that the greatest sailors were the ones who put their crews first. He closed the journal carefully. He was talking about his uncle, about my great-uncle, about Captain Joseph Burnett, who went down with his ship and his men. And he was preparing me, without ever telling me, for this moment, for the chance to finally bring his uncle home. The weight of this multi-generational circle closing was overwhelming. Commander Vance, her earlier antagonism completely dissolved, spoke with difficulty. Commander, I owe you an apology. I treated this mission as a problem to be managed. I couldn't see what you saw. That this was never about protocol or public relations. This was about finishing something that should have been finished 67 years ago. Dr. Ashford, his academic arrogance stripped away by the reality of what they'd witnessed, added, Joseph, I spent my career studying these events from a distance, convincing myself that objectivity required emotional detachment. But you're right. Those men down there, they aren't data points. They're human beings who gave everything. And they deserve more than my analysis. They deserve remembrance. Proper remembrance. Graham Hewitt, the cynical journalist, had tears streaming down his face. I came here expecting another bullshit military mythology story. Instead, I found the most profound truth I've ever witnessed. This isn't mythology, Commander. This is the most real thing I've ever covered. But Burnett wasn't finished. As the technical team finally secured the sealed packet and brought it to the surface, he gathered everyone, crew, scientists, historians, even the hostile parties who'd fought him every step, and he spoke with a clarity that seemed to channel something beyond himself. What we do next matters more than anything we've done so far. We've found these men. We've witnessed their final moments. We've recovered my great-uncle's last words. But this isn't about closure for me, or vindication for any of us. This is about 645 families who've lived with uncertainty, with unanswered questions, with a grief that never had a proper ending. When we return to shore, when we share what we've found, we need to honor not just the dead, but the living who've carried them in their hearts all these decades. He paused, looking at each person in turn. Dr. Ashford, I need your expertise, not to analyze tactical failures, but to tell the story of how these men fought with courage and skill against an enemy who'd disguised themselves as a neutral merchant ship. Can you do that? Can you write their story as the heroic stand it was? Ashford nodded, his voice thick. It would be my honor, Commander, my genuine honor. Commander Vance, I need your strategic mind, not to protect the Navy's reputation, but to ensure that every family member, every descendant, every person touched by this tragedy gets the answers they deserve, without bureaucratic delays or political interference. Can you use your influence for that? Vance straightened, her military bearing returning but transformed by purpose. I'll make it my priority, sir. No protocols will stand between these families and the truth. And Graham, I need your voice, not to expose mythology, but to tell the truth in a way that helps this nation finally grieve properly, finally honor these men the way they deserve to be honored 67 years ago. Can you do that? Hewitt wiped his eyes. I'll tell their story, Commander, the real story, the human story. When they finally opened the sealed packet, Captain Burnett's final report revealed the full horror and heroism of Sydney's last moments. He'd written it in the minutes before the ship went down, knowing he wouldn't survive, determined to leave a record. His words described the shocking moment when the seemingly innocent merchant ship HSK Cormoran revealed itself as a German raider. The desperate battle that followed, the catastrophic damage Sydney sustained, and most movingly the courage of his crew in the face of certain death. My men have fought with a bravery that defies description, he wrote. As I write this, water is flooding the lower decks, and I know we have minutes at most. But not one man has abandoned his post. Not one man has failed his duty. If these words are ever found, know this. HMAS Sydney fought with honor, and her crew died as they lived, in service to Australia and to each other. I am proud beyond measure to have commanded them. Tell their families. They were heroes, everyone. Tell them their deaths mattered. Tell them we never stopped fighting, and we never stopped believing in the values we fought for. That is our legacy. That is our final testament. The reading of those words broke something fundamental in everyone present. The barriers of professional rivalry, institutional loyalty, and emotional detachment simply dissolved. They stood together on that research vessel, above the grave of 645 sailors, and they wept. For the dead, for the families, for the decades of silence and uncertainty, and for the profound privilege of finally bearing witness to this extraordinary sacrifice. When they returned to shore 3 weeks later, the media circus that erupted was unlike anything Australia had seen. But it wasn't the sensational ghost ship coverage that had been expected. Instead, led by Graham Hewitt's extraordinarily moving series of articles, the nation engaged in a collective act of grieving and remembrance. Burnett's team had brought back not just evidence and artifacts, but something infinitely more valuable: the truth, presented with the dignity and compassion it deserved. The memorial service held at the Australian War Memorial drew thousands. Dr. Ashford, who delivered the historical overview, spoke with a passion and humanity that surprised everyone who knew his reputation. He detailed not the failures, but the extraordinary circumstances Sydney faced, an enemy that violated every convention of naval warfare. By disguising itself as a neutral ship, a battle that was essentially an ambush, and a crew that fought with skill and determination despite impossible odds. History, he concluded, has been too harsh on these men. It's time we honored them properly, not as victims of tactical errors, but as warriors who faced evil and fought it with everything they had. Commander Vance, true to her word, had cut through every bureaucratic barrier to ensure that families received full briefings, access to recovered personal effects, and genetic identification where possible. She transformed from a manager of narratives to an advocate for truth, and her work would become the new standard for how the Navy handled historical tragedies.